8 months at Seattle General. That's how long Hannah Clarke had been moving through these corridors with the kind of invisible precision that nurses perfect when nobody's watching. The antiseptic smell never quite fades, it layers beneath the burnt coffee from the break room, the metallic tang of blood from the trauma bay, the ghost of rain from the parking lot still clinging to the edges of morning shift. She restocks the supply cart in Bay 3 with movements that could set a metronome. Each for bag aligned. Each medication label facing forward. Each piece of equipment exactly where muscle memory says it should be. The orderly from the night shift watches her work. He doesn't say anything. Nobody says much to Hannah Clarke. They've learned by now that she doesn't fill silence with small talk. She fills it with competence. She's the one who can start and for in a collapsed vein on the first stick. She's the one the residents call when their patient's trending toward sepsis and they can't quite read the early signs. She's the one positioned between the rush doctors and the vulnerable patients, catching what shouldn't be missed, asking questions that make senior physicians pause. What none of them see, what she makes sure none of them see, is the thing sewn into her jacket lining. A faded patch. Unit insignia so worn the colors have gone the color of old blood. She touches it sometimes when she's alone in the stairwell, a gesture so brief it would look like scratching if anyone was watching. Which they're not. Dr. Mercer first noticed her 3 weeks into her employment. He was doing grand rounds, moving through the unit like a man accustomed to rooms parting for him, and Hannah was checking a post-op dressing on a patient in bed 7. The smell of the antiseptic was fresh. The wound was clean. But something in her posture made Mercer look twice. She'd tilted her head at exactly the right angle to catch the light on the incision line, and her jaw had tightened just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Mercer to know she'd seen something. "How's the pain control?" he asked the patient, moving on before Hannah could answer. "Good, doctor," the patient said. "Hannah's been checking on me every 2 hours." Mercer's pen found his notepad. He's a man built from old money and older certainties. His family name carries weight in 3 counties. His surgical reputation carries more. He wears the kind of cologne that costs more than most people's car payments, and his watch, the Patek Philippe glimpsed between his cuff and wrist, costs roughly what a nurse makes in 4 years. What he doesn't carry well is contradiction. He doesn't handle it when someone beneath his station demonstrates knowledge he didn't expect them to have. He especially doesn't handle it when they demonstrate that knowledge without asking permission. By the 2nd month, Hannah had corrected a medication order 3 times. Not confrontationally. Just small clarifications. "I think the dosage might need adjusting based on his creatinine level, doctor." Mercer had smiled each time and made the changes anyway, which seemed like agreement until you understood it as resentment. She was making him look careless. In his own unit. In front of residents who were supposed to see him as infallible. The real trouble started during grand rounds on a Tuesday in late October. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady fluorescent hymn. The residents clustered around like medical students still stunned by how much they didn't know. Patient in bed 5 was a 67-year-old male, for days post-cholecystectomy, running a fever that wouldn't break. Mercer consulted his chart. Ordered more antibiotics. Classic post-op inflammation, he announced to the residents. Nothing concerning. Hannah was standing back by the supply station, ostensibly organizing equipment, but she was listening. She'd been listening to this patient's vitals for 4 days. She'd watched his temperature climb despite the broad-spectrum coverage. She'd seen the subtle shift in his mental status, the kind of thing that looks like pain medication fogginess to someone who wasn't paying attention. She moved forward. It wasn't dramatic. Just a step closer, chart in hand. "Dr. Mercer," she said. Her voice came out measured. Quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand attention so much as earns it. His white count's been climbing. 8,000 yesterday, 9.2 today. And his lactate is elevated. Might point toward something more than post-op inflammation. The room did that thing rooms do when a subordinate speaks out of turn. A kind of atmospheric shift. Mercer turned to look at her fully for the first time. His eyes held the expression of a man watching someone cross a line he hadn't explicitly drawn but everyone understood was there. "I'm sorry," he said, and there was nothing apologetic in it. "Did you attend medical school while I wasn't looking? Did Johns Hopkins call with an apology for missing your application?" The residents laughed. It was the nervous laughter of people not sure if they were allowed to but taking the cue from authority anyway. Hannah didn't look away. She didn't blush. She didn't apologize. She just held his gaze for 2 seconds, which in a situation like that felt like 20, and then she stepped back to the supply station. But Mercer wasn't finished. He turned to address the residents, gesturing vaguely in her direction like she was a teaching tool rather than a person. "This is what happens when nurses think they're doctors," he said, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that doesn't require evidence to back it up. "You start second-guessing protocol. You start thinking your EMT training qualifies you to interpret lab work. You forget the chain of command exists for a reason. Stay in your lane, people. That's the difference between a well-run unit and chaos." He went back to his chart. The residents shuffled onward like a school of fish, and Hannah stayed exactly where she was, checking for pumps that didn't need checking, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her breathing the kind of control that comes from practice. The thing he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that patient in bed 5 had acute cholecystitis progressing toward necrosis. By the following day, when Mercer finally ordered the imaging he should have ordered 3 days prior, the pathology was evident. The patient needed a second surgery. He pulled through, but he came very close to not pulling through at all. Hannah's suggestion would have caught it sooner. Would have prevented 18 hours of unnecessary organ damage. Mercer didn't mention it. Neither did she. By the time Colonel Hendricks arrived on a stretcher in early November, Hannah had learned how to exist in Seattle General the way a ghost exists in a house, present, useful, completely invisible. The ambulance bay doors swung open with that particular hydraulic sigh they always make. The colonel came through on a gurney, his chart clipped to the side rail, his left shoulder heavily bandaged. 54 years old. Green Beret. Transferred from Walter Reed for specialized post-operative care following an unusual surgical complication. That's all the chart said. That's all it was supposed to say. But Hannah noticed the security clearance notation in his file. The way the admitting physician had been asked to limit information access. Mercer intercepted her in the hallway outside the colonel's room. "This one's important," he said, and something in his voice made it sound like a threat. "Try not to embarrass yourself." She nodded. "Understood, doctor." The colonel was conscious but foggy, the kind of post-op haze that comes from serious pain management. She ran through vitals check and wound assessment with the precision she brought to everything else. The surgical site was wrapped too tightly. The antiseptic smell suggested the dressing had been changed recently, but not recently enough. There was a heat radiating from the area that didn't match the vital signs, a subtle fever signature that only existed if you were looking for it. Signs of infection. Mercer had missed it. Or seen it and decided it wasn't worth mentioning. Hannah made a note in the chart. Ordered a more aggressive wound assessment schedule. Said nothing aloud. It was during the third dressing change, on the evening of the colonel's second day, that something shifted. The colonel had been drifting in and out of consciousness. The fever had been climbing despite antibiotics. Hannah was carefully unwrapping the surgical site, checking for increased erythema when the colonel's eyes opened fully. Really opened. Like something had cut through the medication fog. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was strong enough that she could feel the muscle memory beneath it, the kind of strength that comes from 30 years of physical conditioning. "Kandahar," he whispered. His eyes were locked on hers. "You worked the same cuts we did. I know those hands. I know exactly what those hands have done." The room seemed to compress. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. Hannah's pulse didn't spike. Her breathing didn't change. She'd been trained for worse than recognition. But something in his words had landed. Something in the way he said it, not as a question but as an identification, suggested that whatever Seattle General thought she was, whatever name appeared on her hospital badge, there was a version of her that this man knew. She didn't confirm anything. She just finished the dressing change with the same precision she'd brought to every other task, her hands moving through muscle memory that had nothing to do with surgical nursing and everything to do with field conditions she'd rather forget. "You need rest, Colonel," she said quietly. "The fever will break." "It's not a fever," he said, his voice already fading back into the medicated haze. "It's recognition. And it's going to cause problems." The vending machine hummed its electric monotone as Hannah fed quarters into the slot. Third floor. 3:14 p.m. The surgical interns didn't notice her at first. They were too busy laughing, their voices sharp enough to cut through the afternoon quiet of the hallway outside the ICU. "Did you hear about the nurse who thinks she's special forces or something?" Dr. Rashid's voice carried the particular cruelty of someone still young enough to believe certainty was the same as intelligence. His partner, whose name Hannah had never bothered to learn, laughed like a seal. "Maybe she'll perform your surgery with a pen and some duct tape. Just diagnose it real hard first." Hannah's coffee dropped into the bin with a soft metallic thunk. She retrieved it without rushing, without acknowledgement. The cum was cold in her hands, something to hold that wasn't her own breath. "Hey, Clarke." Rashid turned toward her, his white coat still crisp from the morning, his stethoscope draped like a medal he'd just won. "You gonna tell us what you think is wrong with me? Give us your expert opinion." The hallway held its breath. Two nurses at the station looked away. A phlebotomist checked her watch. Hannah stood motionless for exactly one measured breath, then turned to face them. Her eyes met Rashid's first, then his partner's. In that moment, her composure became a visible thing, not coldness, but a kind of crystalline calm, the sort that made the air around her seem to contract. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply held their gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked toward the ICU, her coffee forgotten in the vending machine alcove. Down the hall, Dr. Mercer leaned against the wall outside a patient room, arms crossed over his chest. His lips curved upward in something too thin to be called a smile. He'd been watching the whole thing, watching the interns mock her, watching her absorb it without breaking, watching her walk past them as if they were furniture. Mercer's satisfaction was palpable, a scent like cologne mixed with something sharper. Approval. Validation. The sensation of a plan working exactly as intended. The following Monday, Colonel Hendrick's fever had climbed to 102.8. Hannah noticed the first signs during the morning dressing change, the surgical site warmer than it should have been, the margins of erythema spreading like a tide line beyond where the infection should have stopped. She'd pulled the chart from Mercer's orders an hour earlier. Prophylactic antibiotics discontinued. No follow-up cultures ordered. No fever protocol initiated. She found Mercer at the nurse's station, his pen moving across a chart with the aggressive precision of someone who'd never been questioned. Hannah approached from the side, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Colonel Hendrick's fever is trending upward. I recommend resuming broad-spectrum coverage and culturing his surgical site." The pen stopped moving. Mercer set it down with deliberate care, the way someone might set down a loaded weapon. When he looked up, his eyes had narrowed to slits. "You recommend?" His voice carried across the ICU like artillery fire. "You recommend?" He stood up, his chair scraping backward with enough force that 3 staff members looked over. "I will not have my clinical judgment questioned by a nurse who thinks 8 months at this hospital qualifies her as a diagnostician." Hannah didn't step back. Her hands remained steady at her sides, her breathing unchanged. "The labs support early SIRS criteria, sir. His white count is climbing, lactate is elevated, and his heart rate is." "Security." Mercer's voice cut through her words like a blade. "I want this woman escorted from my surgical floor. Immediate. She has overstepped her authority for the last time, and I will not tolerate further insubordination." The ICU fell silent. That specific silence that happens when someone has just crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. 2 security guards approached, their expressions uncertain, their hands not quite at their belts but ready to be. Hannah stood motionless. Her jaw tightened, barely perceptible, just the smallest clench of muscle, but her voice, when she spoke, emerged flat and level, each word separated from the next like soldiers in formation. Colonel Hendricks in bed 12 deserves better care than your ego allows, sir. The room exhaled. Mercer's face went the color of raw liver. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came out. Around them, staff pretended to work, pretended not to have heard, pretended not to be witnessing the moment a nurse had looked directly at institutional power and named it for what it was. Hannah turned to the medication cart without waiting for a response. Her hands moved through the motions of her rounds, checking names, verifying doses, administering medications with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed these actions 10,000 times. She completed her charting. She documented the fever trend in Hendricks' file with clinical precision, her assessment written in language so correct and so formal that it couldn't be challenged without appearing defensive. When her shift ended at 7:16 p.m., she walked toward the stairwell. The concrete walls pressed in around her, the acoustic tile above swallowing sound. She descended 2 flights before stopping on the landing between the 3rd and 2nd floors, alone in the fluorescent glare of the emergency lighting. That's when it happened. Just one. A single tear, hot and salt-bright, that escaped from her left eye and tracked down her cheekbone before she could stop it. She stood there in her scrubs with her hands pressed against the cold metal railing, breathing in through her nose, out through her mouth, the way she'd been trained to breathe when the world was imploding. 1 breath. 2 breaths. 3. She wiped the tear away with the heel of her hand, the movement sharp and efficient. Then she turned and descended the remaining stairs without breaking stride, her shoulders squared, her chin level. By the time she pushed through the ground floor exit into the Savannah evening, the moment had already vanished like it had never happened. Her composure had sealed itself shut again, the way armor seals itself over a wound. That night, Hendricks' fever spiked to 103.6. His surgical site wept clear fluid mixed with blood. Hannah changed his dressing at 11:27 p.m. during the night shift, her movements precise, her hand steady. As she was securing the final tape, his eyes focused on hers with sudden clarity. His grip on her wrist was surprisingly strong for a man running a fever high enough to cause delirium. "Kandahar," he whispered. "You were in Kandahar. Same cuts. I know those hands." His fingers traced the thin scar that ran from her wrist toward her thumb, a souvenir from a mortar round in 2016. "I know those hands." Hannah didn't pull away. She met his eyes and held them steady, and in that moment, the ICU seemed to contract around them, the monitors, the hum of ventilators, the fluorescent lights all fading to nothing but the 2 of them and a recognition that existed beyond words. "Rest, Colonel," she said quietly. "I'm going to help you." The fluorescent lights hummed their electric dirge as Hannah stood alone in the trauma bay, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had never actually stopped being a soldier. Colonel Hendricks lay on the stretcher, his skin the color of old bone, his chest rising and falling in the shallow gasps of septic shock. The monitors screamed their alarms in a cacophony that had sent 10 doctors fleeing through the automatic doors like rats abandoning a sinking ship. 10. She'd counted them. The chief surgical resident. The attending from infectious disease. The hospitalist. The trauma fellow. The anesthesia team, all 4 of them. The nursing supervisor. The cardiologist they'd paged for support. And Mercer, who'd been the last to turn away, his hand already reaching for his phone before his shoes hit the corridor tile. Mercer had stopped at the threshold. She could still see his silhouette against the hallway fluorescence, could still hear his voice cutting through the monitor alarms like a scalpel through flesh. "Nurse Clarke, you are not to touch this patient beyond comfort care. You are a nurse, not a surgeon, and I will not have this man's death blamed on your delusions of competence. That is a direct order." The door had whispered shut behind him. Now the machine screamed alone, and Hannah's breathing remained level as Arctic water. Her mind had already shifted into the space it occupied during the worst moments in Kandahar, present, calculating, empty of everything except the next right action. Blood pressure 70/40. Oxygen saturation 81 and dropping. Her pupils dilated, processing information at a frequency that would look like stillness to anyone watching. She'd known something was wrong with Hendricks from the moment she'd examined his surgical site 3 hours earlier. The infection wasn't progressing like a standard post-op contamination. The fever arc was too steep. The inflammatory markers had climbed from benign to catastrophic in the span of a single shift. The pattern matched the case studies she'd reviewed in the encrypted Army intelligence briefing documents she read every other night on her personal laptop, the ones protected by a password that changed daily and routed through servers she wasn't technically supposed to access. Bioweapon exposure. That's what the briefing had said. Hendricks had been at Fort Liberty 2 weeks before his admission, part of a joint task force evaluating defensive protocols against suspected Syrian agents. The exposure itself had been minimal, a minor breach during a training simulation, but the incubation period for the engineered pathogen was unpredictable. 3 weeks. For weeks. Sometimes longer. Sometimes the human body could wall it off. Sometimes the body became a garden. When Mercer had missed the infection developing in Hendricks' surgical site, Hannah had immediately documented the findings in her encrypted channels. Not to anyone on staff. Not to anyone who could identify her. Just to the handler she'd never met, the one whose responses appeared in her secure email as read receipts with no message attached. The information was being processed. Analyzed. Added to a 2-year intelligence file. And blowing her cover to reveal the truth about Hendricks' condition would end that entire operation. She repositioned him now, her movements economical and sure. His body had begun the cascade into irreversible shock, that point of no return where organs began dying faster than medicine could save them. She had maybe 3 minutes before the clock stopped running on recovery. 3 minutes before Colonel Marcus Hendricks, who'd been leading men through hellfire since before she was born, became a name on a death certificate that Mercer would sign with a satisfied pen stroke. Her hands found the femoral artery by pressure point alone, the faint throb of desperate blood trying to escape through a torn vessel she could feel but not see. She moved to the crash cart, opened the drawer, and extracted a hemostat. The metal was cool against her palm. Familiar. She'd held this same tool under different lighting, in a field hospital that smelled like diesel and copper and her own sweat. His oxygen saturation dropped, 89, 85, 81. The monitor's beeping accelerated into a frantic rhythm. His trachea was deviating, pulled toward the right side of his chest by pressure that had nowhere else to go. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart. He would die in minutes if she didn't decompress it. She prepped his chest with betadine, the antiseptic sharp in her nostrils, and counted ribs with her fingertips. The anatomy didn't change whether you were in a trauma bay in Savannah or a field tent in Kandahar. Ribs still connected at predictable intervals. The intercostal space at the second rib was still 1 thumb's width below the collarbone. The needle still went in at an angle over the superior rib margin to avoid the neurovascular bundle running along the inferior rib edge. The needle decompression kit was in her hand before she'd finished positioning him. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Felt the resistance of skin, then tissue, then the sudden give of entering the pleural space. The hiss of released pressure was immediate and unmistakable, air escaping the cavity like a breath finally exhaled after holding it for hours. The monitor's oxygen saturation began climbing. 84, 88. 92, his color changed from ashen gray to something approaching human. His blood pressure ticked upward, 75 now, then 80. Not safe. Not stable. But moving away from the edge of irreversible shock. In the hallway outside, she could hear Mercer's voice, pitched low and rapid fire, the tone of someone building a case with methodical fury. Tom, I need you to listen carefully. I have a nurse who just committed gross negligence against my direct orders. I need the board president involved immediately. I don't care that it's 3 a.m. He was calling allies. Building a network. moving to stage 3 escalation, the strategic moves that would make his attacks look institutional rather than personal. Hannah focused on what she could control. She packed Hendrik's surgical wound with gauze, applying pressure to the femoral bleeder with the same technique she'd used on 30 soldiers in the mountains of Kandahar, where the altitude was thin and the margins for error were non-existent. Mercer continued, his voice muffled through the door. "I need the chief nursing officer. I need the credentialing committee chair. No, not tomorrow. Tonight. I'm going to need documentation of every patient this nurse has touched in her 8 months here." A pause. Then, "Yes, I'm aware it's the middle of the night. This is a patient safety issue. That supersedes scheduling conventions." She administered crystalloid through 2 large-bore 4s, her movements precise and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world instead of minutes before institutional machinery would begin grinding toward her termination. Hendrik's blood pressure stabilized at 95/60ths. Not normal. Not good. But survivable. The body could recover from shock if given the chance. The body was a remarkable instrument when someone knew how to play it. She called for an OR team, got the transfer orders written under the covering physician's name, a doctor 3 floors up who'd already gone home for the night and whose name she forged with a signature she'd been practicing for 8 months in case exactly this moment arrived. The forgery was a felony. Adding it to her record was another nail in the coffin. But a living man with a felony conviction beating a dead man with a clean one any day of the week. She rode with Hendricks to the elevator, maintained pressure on his wound, watched his vital signs climb with glacial slowness back toward the land of the living. The surgical team was assembling when she transferred him to the OR stretcher. Someone, a resident she'd never seen before, looked at her with confusion. "Who authorized this?" "Dr. Chen," Hannah said, which was true in a manner of speaking. The standing order for hemorrhage control takes priority over any other considerations. The doors to the operating room slid closed behind the stretcher, and Hannah was alone in the hallway at 4:17 a.m., still wearing her blood-stained scrubs, still moving at the frequency of adrenaline and training and the particular kind of calm that only came from people who'd already survived worse. She turned toward the nurse's station to finish her documentation. Her badge wouldn't unlock the door. She tried it twice. The third time, a security guard she'd never seen before appeared beside her, his hand resting on his belt. "Ms. Clarke, your access has been suspended. I'm going to need you to come with me. I need to complete my charting," Hannah said. "That's for administration to determine." His voice was carefully neutral. "Trained." Mercer must have briefed security before she'd even finished with Hendricks. "Your shift ended 4 minutes ago. Your badge has been deactivated. I'll escort you to the employee exit." She could have fought it. Could have demanded to finish her work. Could have invoked patient rights or documentation standards or any number of legitimate reasons why leaving now was inappropriate. Instead, she nodded, untied her scrubs, and followed the guard toward the elevator. Her military training whispered that compliance in a hostile situation was sometimes the only weapon you had left. As the elevator descended, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mission integrity compromised. Prepare for contingency protocol. Further instructions forthcoming." She didn't respond. Didn't need to. The 2-year operation she'd been embedded to protect had just died the same way Colonel Hendricks nearly had, bleeding out in a trauma bay with everyone watching and no one willing to save it. The monitor's screaming woke the trauma bay at 2:47 in the morning. Colonel Hendricks' surgical site had ruptured like something living inside him was trying to escape. Blood pooled across the gauze, spreading faster than the nurses could blot it. His blood pressure dropped from 90 to 70 in the span of a breath. 50. 30. The alarm's pitch climbed higher, urgent and animal. Hannah was there before anyone called her. She'd been monitoring him from the adjacent room, and the sound of that alarm moving from warning to catastrophic was the only call she needed. She initiated the code herself, her voice steady into the overhead speaker. "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. Massive hemorrhage, post-op day 3. 10 doctors responded. Not because the case looked salvageable, but because protocol required it. Dr. Mercer moved through them like a general inspecting troops, his presence making the air pressure change in the small room. The resident called out vitals with mechanical precision. 80 units of blood products already ordered. 2 units running wide open through the rapid infuser. The numbers weren't moving. Blood pressure still dropping. Mercer assessed the wound for exactly 40 seconds. Then he turned to face the surgical team, his eyes moving from face to face like a gun on a pivot mount. "Unsalvageable," he said. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd already written the ending. One surgeon hesitated. "Sir, if we crack the chest, open cardiac massage, no." Mercer's response cut through the possibility before it could take root. Massive retroperitoneal hemorrhage. No blood bank in North America has enough units for a 5% survival projection. This is a futile code. The first doctor walked out. Then the second. Then 3 more in succession, their shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that sounded like surrender. 5 doctors remaining. Mercer moved toward the door, and that was the signal. The remaining 5 followed him like iron filings obeying magnetism. All 10. Gone. The trauma bay was suddenly empty except for Hannah, 2 nurses, and a dying man. Mercer paused at the doorway, his hand on the frame. When he turned back, his eyes found Hannah with the precision of a laser. "Nurse Clarke, you are not to touch this patient beyond basic monitoring. Is that understood?" It wasn't a request. It was an order meant to be obeyed. Hannah didn't respond with words. She didn't have to. She was already pulling on fresh gloves. The monitor showed a new crisis blooming, the pneumothorax building in Hendrick's left chest, pressure collapsing his lung like a fist closing around tissue. She prepped the second intercostal space with antiseptic that smelled like industrial iron, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from doing something 300 times while people were shooting at you. The needle went in. 14-gauge angiocath, driven through skin and muscle and pleura until the hiss of air escaping the pressurized chest filled the quiet. That sound meant something. That sound meant lungs could expand again. That sound meant 3 more minutes of life. The monitor ticked back into rhythm. Oxygen saturation began climbing. 72. 80. 88. Stable. But the bleeding wouldn't stop. His abdomen was distending, the internal hemorrhage spreading across organs and tissue like spilled wine soaking into white cloth. Hannah's hands moved on their own now, muscle memory and training taking over conscious thought. She found the femoral artery where it pulsed against the groin. No time for a surgical field. No time for proper instruments. She clamped it with a tourniquet and packed the wound with combat gauze, thick, absorbent material that had stopped bleeding in Kandahar when there were Taliban fighters on the ridgeline and no surgical team within 40 miles. The technique came back to her body before her mind could question it. Pressure and speed. Pressure and speed. The alarms quieted. Not because he was healing. Because she was buying time. Hours, maybe. Long enough to get him to the surgical ICU where intensive monitoring and transfusion protocols could hold the line. The night shift nurses stared at her with expression somewhere between gratitude and fear. They'd watched a nurse transform into something else entirely. Someone with hands that had held lives together in places they couldn't even imagine. Hannah was still on the second floor line when security arrived at 3:15. 2 officers in Navy uniforms, looking uncomfortable but professional. The tall one carried a manila envelope. "Captain," he caught himself. "Ms. Clarke. We need your badge and restricted access card." She handed them over without argument, blood still crusted under her fingernails where it had dried against the cuticles. They didn't seem to know what had just happened. They only knew they'd been ordered to escort a suspended employee out of the building. The envelope contained her suspension notice, effective immediately, pending investigation into scope of practice violations and patient endangerment. She was to have no contact with hospital staff pending the hearing. No access to patient records. No communication regarding Colonel Hendricks' case. The words blurred together. None of it mattered except for one detail buried in paragraph 4. Patient Colonel James Hendricks has been transferred to surgical ICU with upgraded prognosis from terminal to guarded condition. Alive. He was alive. But the 2-year operation she'd been embedded to protect was dead. She couldn't monitor him for bioweapon exposure symptoms anymore. Couldn't access encrypted reporting channels without her hospital credentials. Couldn't complete the mission that had cost her Marcus's mother, taking him to Seattle, sleeping in hospital housing, doing basketball camps without his mom there to watch. 16 months of separation to establish a cover identity deep enough that nobody questioned the nurse who knew military medicine too well. Gone. All of it gone in the time it took a surgeon to order 10 people to walk away from a dying man. She drove to Victory Drive in the pre-dawn darkness, her scrub still stained with Hendricks' blood. The all-night diner glowed like a beacon against the black sky. Neon sign casting everything in shades of pink and electric blue. She slid into a corner booth where she could see both exits, old habits dying hard. The waitress recognized the scrubs immediately. Rough shift, honey. Hannah nodded. Didn't trust her voice yet. The coffee arrived. Black. Steam rising off it in lazy spirals. 3 a.m. The place was mostly empty except for a drunk couple 3 booths down, their voices sharp with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting in a vehicle at closing time. The fluorescent lights hummed that particular hum, steady and hypnotic and hollow. She stared at her reflection in the dark window. Hollow-eyed. Blood crusted at her hairline where sweat had pushed it there. Cheekbones sharp enough to cut on. The coffee went cold untouched. Her phone had 6 missed calls from her handler. She couldn't return them. Open lines. Unsecured. The mission was compromised, which meant his number was probably burned now, the whole chain of communication going dormant until they figured out how badly this had blown up. A text came through at 3:42 a.m. Marcus. Mom, where are you? Are you okay? Please call me. She typed back, I'm fine. Home soon. The lie felt heavier than the truth. At 7 in the morning, the formal termination notice arrived via hospital courier. Hearing scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. in the administrator's conference room. Bring representation if desired. Dr. Mercer had submitted a 40-page investigative report documenting pattern of insubordination, scope of practice violations, and clinical judgment that exceeded her licensure authority. 12 instances where her nursing assessments contradicted attending physicians' orders. Each one framed like evidence of dangerous autonomy. The nursing school registrar had flagged the employment gap, 4 months she'd spent at Fort Bragg in intelligence training, covered by a story about working at a rural clinic that had since closed. The gap looked suspicious under scrutiny. Mercer's case was thorough. Procedural. Almost airtight. Hannah sat in her kitchen as sunlight moved across the tile, her son's basketball gear in the corner where he'd left it yesterday, and understood that she'd just sacrificed everything she'd built to save one man's life. And she'd do it again. Pain was information, and this pain told her that she'd made the right choice, even if the world would interpret it as the end of everything. Friday morning. 10 a.m. The conference room at Seattle General smelled like burnt coffee and furniture polish. Hannah sat in a chair that faced 3 hospital administrators, a legal counsel with a folder the thickness of a patient chart, and an empty leather seat where Dr. Mercer would position himself. The rain outside hammered the windows like applause for something nobody wanted to celebrate. She wore her scrubs. Not her dress clothes. A small act of defiance. She'd come straight from the night shift, hadn't changed, hadn't performed the ritual of looking professional for the people who were about to erase her. The board president, a woman named Richardson with silver hair and eyes that had learned to apologize without speaking, shuffled papers. Captain Clarke, we're here to discuss the circumstances surrounding your unauthorized treatment of Colonel Hendricks on the night of. The door burst open. Marcus. 16 years old, 5'11", breathtaking in the way he was alive and moving and entirely out of breath. He was holding something. Not a backpack. Not a folder. A wooden box. Mahogany with brass hinges, the kind that came from one specific place. The kind that couldn't be replaced. Mom, they need to see these. His voice cracked on the last word. He didn't wait for permission. He flipped the box, and the contents, 23 years of metal and ribbon and weight, scattered across the conference table like coins from a shattered vault. The bronze star with V device glinted under the fluorescent lights, catching the edge of the moment and holding it there. A silver star followed. Then another. Then the purple bar and white ribbon of the Purple Heart. Once. Twice. 3 separate instances where Hannah Clarke's body had paid for decisions her hands had made. The board fell silent. That was when the wheelchair appeared in the doorway. Colonel Hendricks. Still pale, still moving with the caution of someone who understood that pain was information and his body was screaming data. His left arm was across his chest, his surgical sight still tender beneath the uniform dress blue someone had brought him that morning. He locked eyes with Hannah. His voice came like a radio transmission from very far away. Valkyrie 6. You were Valkyrie 6. The name hung in the air like humidity before rain. Valkyrie 6. The call sign they'd given her because she operated at night, because she moved through chaos with the precision of something that shouldn't exist in daylight, because she'd walked into a burning outpost in Kandahar when everyone else was running out. The Marine Corps liaison, a major named Grant whose presence suddenly made sense, stepped forward and opened the folder in her hands. Her voice was steady, authoritative, the kind of composure that came from briefing generals. Captain Hannah Clarke, for extraordinary heroism under fire during Operation Platinum Resolve, performed combat surgical procedures under sustained enemy contact, saving 14 lives when the battalion surgeon was killed. Another breath. The citation continued. When the outpost came under coordinated attack, Captain Clarke, operating in a non-medical combat role, assumed surgical responsibilities for 3 consecutive hours despite ongoing indirect fire, maintaining positive patient outcomes through improvisation and disciplined medical decision-making. Her actions prevented an estimated 12 additional casualties. Dr. Mercer's chair scraped backward. He stood, his face the color of something that had been buried too long. This is fabricated. This is a circus. She bought these on eBay. I don't care what medals she waves around, she violated direct orders, she performed procedures outside her scope of practice, Chen was there. Suddenly, the IT director, a man with the posture of someone who had once worn a different uniform, handed the board president a USB drive. His voice was flat. Disgusted. The particular tone a Navy veteran saves for watching someone dishonor their oath. Dr. Mercer attempted to delete security. Footage from the night of the emergency. Complete deletion sequence started at 2:11 a.m., 43 minutes after he ordered the other 9 physicians to stand down. 9. Not 10. Hannah understood, Mercer hadn't just abandoned the patient. He'd abandoned his colleagues' moral authority too. They'd followed him. He'd led them out. I preserved every frame, Chen continued. Every second of those 10 doctors walking away from a viable patient. Every moment of Captain Clarke stabilizing him alone. I reported the tampering to Hospital Council, the State Medical Board, and CMS. The chief nursing officer, a woman named Yolanda Rodriguez who had worked intensive care for 28 years and whose respect couldn't be bought with a title, opened her own folder. You've created a documented hostile work environment. For separate HR complaints, independently filed, corroborating pattern of targeted harassment against military personnel. The board has already notified legal. Mercer's hands were shaking now. Not from fear. From something worse, the understanding that the ground was solid beneath him and he was still falling. Richardson stood. The room followed, a physical grammar of authority reasserting itself. Dr. Mercer, your surgical privileges are suspended effective immediately pending investigation. You're to have no direct patient contact, no administrative duties, and no access to institutional systems. We'll reconvene in 14 days. The next 6 months disassembled his life with the systematic precision of a surgical team working in reverse. The State Medical Board opened a formal investigation into patient abandonment and evidence tampering. 3 residents filed complaints about his teaching methods. A patient family attorney subpoenaed the security footage for a different case entirely. Another patient Mercer had declared unsalvageable 2 months prior. His malpractice insurance carrier sent a letter reviewing his coverage. His wife of 19 years filed for separation. Hannah watched none of this directly. She was back on the floor, her cover adjusted, her real mission continuing. Colonel Hendricks recovered. His memory returned in fragments that assembled into intelligence, confirmation of bioweapon exposure, details of an attack prevented, 37 soldiers who would go home because of what he remembered. Marcus came to visit her at work one afternoon. Saw the unit patch. The question came quietly. Why did you hide who you were? She was checking 4 lines, her hands moving with the muscle memory of Kandahar and 18 months at Seattle General and everything that happened in between. Because the mission required it. Because some things matter more than recognition. But that wasn't entirely true. Some things matter more than recognition until the moment comes when they don't. 6 months later, Hannah took her lunch break near the 3rd floor windows. Below, in the parking lot, Dr. Mercer loaded medical supplies into a van. Not surgical scrubs. A polo shirt with a company logo. The State Medical Board had suspended his license. The hospital had terminated him. This was what remained, a man driving medical supplies between rural clinics. No patients. No residents. No authority. Just boxes and driving routes and the long, quiet dissolution of everything he'd built on contempt. Hannah pulled the faded 3rd Special Forces Group unit patch from inside her jacket lining. The one Hendricks had recognized by touch when he was delirious. The one that confirmed everything. She unpinned her temporary cover story patch and secured the real one to her scrub pocket where everyone could finally see it. Chen walked past. Saw it. Nodded once. 2 residents stopped to ask about it. She told them about Kandahar, about the night the battalion surgeon died, about the 14 soldiers whose names she still carried. Colonel Hendricks sent a handwritten letter thanking her for saving his life twice. Marcus framed her Bronze Star citation and hung it in their living room. On her last shift before transferring to Walter Reed, Hannah passed the break room where Mercer had once stood watching her with contempt. A new chief of surgery, a former Army trauma surgeon who understood that credentials meant nothing compared to competence, asked her to brief the residents on combat medical procedures. She stood in the same conference room where Mercer had humiliated her, and she taught 12 residents about hemorrhage control, about making impossible decisions, about staying when everyone else walks away. When she finished, she closed with one sentence that several of them wrote in their notebooks. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Outside, through the window, the medical supply van pulled away toward the highway, and nobody watched it go. If you've made it this far, you already know, the quiet ones are always the dangerous ones. Subscribe for more stories like this. Like if you believe the people who save lives deserve more respect than the people who merely claim authority. And comment, tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value?